by like companies driving down prices on existing products, but then coming out with completely new things to totally wipe out the way that the industry worked before, right? And that the real threat to monopoly is not someone coming and undercutting their prices, but having a totally new technology that's much better, and that most of the gains from consumers come from that as well, not from like competing down the prices of existing goods. And so this process of creative destruction, Schumpeter argued, should be like really the focus of industrial policy, encouraging it. And that might actually require having concentrated industries so firms can both afford to do research and development and reap the benefits of doing that research and development. And that most innovation is motivated by the goal of getting temporary monopoly power. And therefore, industrial policy should focus on creating new products rather than just eliminating static distortions. And in fact, static distortions should be sort of a second tier thing. So by static, as some of you guys who came to office hours yesterday meant, I mean, everything we've been talking about so far, all this like, dead weight loss from too little quantity or distortions of the characteristics of the products. Okay, so I think that the Schumpeterian competitive process sort of resonates with how we think about high-tech industries. So, Facebook came in and basically, not by charging a lower price or whatever, wiped away all the previous social networks and many other forms of social exchange, right? Apple has repeatedly introduced new products that have sort of changed the whole texture of the market. Their product, their whole process is about constantly introducing new products rather than just marginally improving old products or reducing the prices. Google is similarly constantly introducing these whole new areas to the competition space. And so some would argue that Google has become now a bit of a monopolist. It controls so many areas. And maybe we even would agree that there's some static distortions from that. They're putting too many advertisements on the side of the thing, or they're distorting search results, et cetera. But the question is, if by prohibiting them from doing that, you even reduced by a small amount the chance that Google was created in the first place, think of like how little costs there are associated with those things and how much cost there would be associated with Google never having entered the industry in the first place, right? So not saying that that would happen, but it's an important thing to consider, perhaps even more important than the distortions now from any practice Google does. Smartphones and apps are another big area of this. It seems like every 6 months there's a whole new business model of how you even structure the marketplace on this stuff. In other industries, it's not so clear that there's as much sort of constant revolutionary change. In operating systems, I think that there's been quite a bit less evolution, though maybe that's because of the dominant position that Microsoft had. So that's a case where a monopoly firm actually was sort of inhibiting progress potentially. So I think a key question for industrial policy is how do we keep this process of creative destruction going, rather than just how do we get the most or the highest quality goods produced at the moment. So an interesting analogy that Gary Becker used to show the importance of dynamics was to think about crime. Now, most crime is committed by the poor rather than the rich. And there's a famous quote about this. This isn't exactly the right quote. The exact right quote is in your syllabus, but it's by Anatole France, and he says, "The law in its majestic equality forbids the poor and rich man equally from sleeping underneath a bridge, stealing a loaf of bread, or sleeping, or there was some other thing." Does anyone have the syllabus? No. Oh, well. And the point is that most criminal activity is actually redistributive. It takes from someone who's relatively wealthy and gives to someone who's relatively poor. And from a static perspective, if we think that the poor value the marginal utility of wealth greater than the rich do, then much, if not most, of crime is actually, from a static perspective, beneficial. So why do we have this big problem with crime? Like, why don't we like crime, right? Well, whenever you reach an absurd conclusion like this, the right thing to do is usually to examine the premises that led you to that conclusion, right? And the premises that led to it was just looking at a criminal act in isolation and not thinking about what would be the implications of allowing people to commit criminal acts. What were the dynamic effects? And I think crime is legal because it would encourage people to spend all their time trying to figure out how to steal from people rather than doing things that are productive. And people would waste a lot of resources on trying to prevent other people from stealing from them. And the chance that people would no longer work hard in order to acquire things because people could steal them could really act as a major drag. Now, it will be optimal to do some redistribution, as we'll talk about on Tuesday, but this might have you inadvertently do more than optimal redistribution. Now, none of these effects show up in a simple static analysis, and therefore it doesn't make any sense to have a theory of crime without thinking about what are the things that are encouraged by allowing crime to go on, right? And Schumpeter would argue that the same thing is true in industrial economics. They're trying to think about, monopoly or, competition policy purely based on whether, the industry is producing enough or not, is just as stupid as trying to think about crime purely in terms of who it's transferring resources between. The similarities between crime and intellectual property are actually significantly broader. So one thing to note about crime is that the way we usually punish crime is by throwing people in jail. And that's a really inefficient way of punishing people, right? Like if we charge someone a fine, then that's a transfer from them to the government. That's not an inefficient way of punishing. That transfers resources from one person to the other, but it doesn't destroy social resources, right? But in crime, when you throw someone in jail, it's not only costly to the person who gets thrown in jail without being beneficial to us, it also costs us something to put that person in jail, right? It apparently costs on the order of $100,000 per year to put someone in jail. And therefore, deterring crime has an inefficiency cost that's not true for a Pigouvian tax, right? Similarly, encouraging innovation by giving intellectual property has an inefficiency cost, namely the deadweight loss associated with those patents, right? With the monopoly power granted by those patents. So encouraging innovation will have the same sorts of trade-offs involved in crime that we're trading off, trying to discourage the activity, or in this case, encourage it, with the static costs of enforcement. Okay. So one harm created by intellectual property is just the static dead weight loss. But Kevin, can you think of some other harms that are created by intellectual property?
Well, one advantage of not having intellectual property, I think that people make an argument for open source software, for example, is that it's easier for people to collaborate and use that software to build on and improve. So
absolutely.
Yeah,
to do sort of follow-on innovations. If you know there's a patent on something, you're much less likely to build on it because you know that if you sell it or even if you try to use it, you might be infringing someone's patent and you're going to have to go through some complicated process of licensing it from them and whatever. Or even if you could sell it and do that licensing negotiation with that person afterwards, they're going to try to take a chunk of the value that you actually created, right? And so you might as well work on something else other than the area that's already patented, right? Another problem is that there's often a lot of litigation and negotiations that can be costly or complex, and the patent system is very imperfect in figuring out what should be patented, what constitutes a thing, and so a lot of it ends up getting tied up in court stuff rather than actually supplying the monopoly that we're trying to. Yeah, Ned?
I just wanted to make another
Yep.
point. It costs between $15,000 and $100,000 or more
Yep.
just to get a patent. So
Yeah, so patents are expensive, not just to the people who apply for them, but to society because we have to do a lot of time processing legally the claims that are made, right? They can also potentially reduce the intrinsic motivation that people have to create new innovations. So because if you patent something and you're really in it for the glory, not for the money, then the fact that it's patented might actually in some ways hurt you. Because now you sell it off to a company, that company has a patent on it, they reduce the quantity to raise the price, but that reduces the visibility of your product. And that's one reason I think that the open source movement has been doing all this open source stuff, is that they know that if it's open source, it'll be broadly used, and that'll make people feel good about contributing to it. They know no one will ever close it off and therefore reduce. So like, for example, with my academic work, I try to make all that as freely available as possible because I want it to get attention and be broadly adopted. Okay. So some evidence of this was given in a paper by one of my friends, Heidi Williams. What she did is she looked at Celera, which was was a private company that was competing with the government to discover the human genome. And some of the genes in the genome were discovered by Celera, and some of them were discovered by the government. The ones that were discovered by the government were unpatented and were made freely available to researchers. The ones that were discovered by Celera were patented, and you had to get a license from Celera to work on them. And what she found is that on average, the number of citations in publications of that gene was a half a publication less for Celera genes than for government genes. And that the probability of discovering a medical application of various different types was, depending on what type, 16% or 3% lower for a Celera gene than for a government gene. Okay. Nonetheless, I think that getting rewards to innovation is very important. So the reason is that even if the entrepreneur who comes up, or the innovator who comes up with the innovation, receives all the monopoly profit, they still create this externality from the consumer surplus that they generate, right? And that means that it's a very beneficial activity. This is sometimes called the market maker or entrepreneurial externality. Now, this can be lessened if there's a lot of price discrimination. But as we saw, it's pretty hard to do price discrimination in a very rich or perfect way, right? In the pharmaceutical industry, it's big, but very imperfect. Sometimes when you negotiate over patent use, you can price discriminate somewhat by looking at what the company's going to use the thing for, and that can help you capture some more of the value. Another reason for having intellectual property is that in the absence of formal government-sponsored intellectual property, a lot of people will keep the details of a product secret as a trade secret so that they can maintain a monopoly over it, whereas once the government protects it, they don't need to maintain that trade secrecy. Okay. So one study that tried to look at the benefits of intellectual property protection was based on medicines. And what they did is they looked at medicines that were created somewhere but then had to be sort of adapted to be sold in a particular other country. And whether the company came and introduced that drug into the other market turned out to be very related to the intellectual property protection. So countries that had long-lived patents and strong patents, after any given number of years, say after 5 years, were much more likely, 40%, to have already